Hey everyone, thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be in chapter 16 of Genesis. Many years ago, I read a story about a young man who was in Japan and he was having a really tough time. And I tried to find the story again and I wasn't able to, so forgive me if you know it and I get something wrong. But this man was on a business trip and he was delayed, so he ended up staying the night. The following day, he slept in even though he needed to be getting on the road to head home. And then to top it off, the next day, the wagon that he was using to haul his goods had also broken. Several hours later went by and he was finally saddled up and on his way home, just as in the horizon, the first atomic bomb landed on Hiroshima, where his home was. Had all of those delays not happened, he would have been right in the middle of that destruction. That story has stuck with me over the many years since I heard it in a sermon so long ago. And I would like to tell you that I'm patient and I never get upset when things cause a delay, but that wouldn't be honest. That wouldn't be the truth. But there are many times when I hit every single light red, or when I'm standing in line in the store and it doesn't move as fast as the other lines, I try to think about this story. We all hate interruptions, but every time Jesus was interrupted in the Gospels, usually a miracle would follow. What I'm trying to say is sometimes God allows delays in our lives for a reason. Maybe it could be to protect you. That red light that you got to, or that flat tire that you might have had, maybe it just saved you from being in the path of a drunk driver or something further down the road. Maybe while you're standing in line at the store and your line doesn't move, you are being delayed until some kind of danger that was in your path down the road has been removed or passed by. Maybe that delay is in acquiring something that you've been looking forward to, and you really don't understand why God doesn't speed up the process. It could very well be that you are not ready yet for whatever it is that you're asking for. In this chapter, Abram and Sarai are growing impatient waiting on a child. God has made them a promise, and the promises are something that God always keeps. But like the generations of today, we don't like waiting. You know, Christmas used to be torture for me as a kid. I'd stare at all of those presents under the tree every day, just wondering what was inside those. One year, my mom taught me how to wrap presents. She says I was big enough to help with that now. And I was okay with this because if you know how to wrap presents, you also know how to unwrap them delicately and then rewrap them. I had seen underneath the tree some boxes that I knew were cassette tapes that I wanted. Yes, I'm that old. And one of them was also a new video game. After sneaking the gifts into my room, I first unwrapped the music tapes and made copies of them and rewrapped it. Then I opened the one that had the video game in it and I stuck an old game inside that carton and rewrapped it and then put it back underneath the Christmas tree. And at first I thought, boy, this is a genius move. I enjoyed all of those things in the month before Christmas. And I thought, hey, this was great. I'm going to do this every year. But when Christmas came around, all I had was an album that I've already listened to and an old game that was in a new box. So in addition to my newly acquired stealth techniques, I also had to develop acting skills on the spot so I would seem excited as I opened these gifts for a second time. In this chapter, we're going to see the consequences of the impatience of Abram and Sarai as they grew tired of waiting and they too tried to pull a fast one. They tried to do things their own way. But sadly, the consequences of their action way back then are still causing trouble for the people of Israel to this very day. So in Genesis 16, as usual, let's begin with verses 1 through 3. Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, Now behold, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Please go into my maid. Perhaps I will obtain children through her. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarai. After Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar the Egyptian, her maid, and gave gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. God has promised Abram that he would be the father of many nations. We've seen this in time and time after the last few chapters. And as time went by and still no child, he cried out in the previous chapter, what good is all of this stuff if Eliezer of Damascus is going to be my heir? He thought all that he had was going to be left to a trusted servant. So in the previous chapter, God took Abram aside and again affirmed his promise and added that the promised son would come from his own loins. They trusted God enough to believe his promise, or at least Abram did. Sarai apparently trusted that God would give her husband Abram a son, but in verse 2, she seems to have arrived at the conclusion that the son would not come from her. Even 2 chapters from now, the year before she would have this child, she laughed when she was told yet again that she would be a mother. So you can see by her wording here that she's thinking in her mind, well, Abram isn't the problem. God said that the child would come from his own body. That means I must be the problem. Now, she is right in the sense that God opens and closes the womb. Many women over the years have suffered what Sarai went through and acknowledged the same thing in despair. Hannah knew a thing about that. Rachel knew a thing about that, and many people throughout the scriptures. And right here, Sarai had the opportunity to be a model of faith to those women, someone that they could look back to in scripture in the future and learn wisdom from. But Sarai is human, and she's frustrated, and she's getting old, and she's impatient. I worked with a guy one time that told me he was so old he never bought green bananas because he may not live long enough to enjoy them. So Sarai suggests, or should I say commands, her husband that they use a surrogate mother. Now, if Abram were to conceive by all legal rights in a surrogacy, the child would technically belong to Sarai and Abram, her husband. While that might be legal, it isn't always that simple because emotions get in the way, and emotions will cause difficulty. Speaking from the view of a stepfather, I can say that I love all of my stepchildren as if they were my very own. I have a stepson that is now into his mid-20s, and I love him just as much as my own. I am a stepchild myself. My last name wasn't always Griffin. When I was 6, I was legally adopted by the best man that I've ever known in my whole life. He showed me that there is no step in children. I was his son, and that was that. I have no trouble in my mind or my heart loving them as if they were mine biologically. But they were born before I married their mother. Now, had a child been born after I was married to their mother, and that child was not mine, you could see how that might complicate things a little bit. From an emotional standpoint, I think it would be hard to get the images out of your mind of your spouse using a surrogate partner. Sarai was really only thinking of herself at this point. In verse 2, she says, perhaps I will obtain children through her. She was thinking of herself and the baby at that moment. But when she gets what she asked for, we're going to see in the following verses that these emotions took over afterward. And there's remorse, there's regret, and now there's conflict in their marriage. Before it appears that I'm placing all of this blame on Sarai, I want to include that Abram's sin was also listed in verse 2. It says, Abram listened to the voice of his wife Sarai. Okay, maybe I should phrase that differently. Listening to his wife wasn't the part that was sinful. I hope any of you men out there listening to this don't go and use this verse to get out of listening to your spouse. Now, hear me out before you ladies start throwing stones at me. In Genesis 3, after Eve took of the forbidden fruit and gave it to Adam to eat too, God placed an order of hierarchy in the marriage. In Genesis 3:16, it says, to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you will bring forth children, yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. In that verse right after that one, God turns his attention to Adam and begins to announce his his punishment. And the words that the Lord began with in verse 17 of Genesis chapter 3 says, because you have listened to the voice of your wife. Again, this does not mean that a husband is free to ignore his wife and all that she says. A husband and a wife are a team. They do things together. In a relationship, they should be in the same car going the same direction. But God has ordained the husband to hold the steering wheel. Don't send me hateful emails. Don't unfollow me. The headship of the husband is found throughout the Old and the New Testaments. The sin of Abram was not in giving Sarai his ear and listening to her and paying attention. His fault was in approving this plan and not taking the idea to the Lord in prayer first. Abram should have said, darling, I love you, but I think we need to wait on the Lord on this. The Lord has made us a promise. I am married to you, not to Hagar, not to any of your handmaids or your servants. That's what Abram should have done. So by agreeing to this flawed plan, they both sinned. Not only did they sin against God by not trusting his promise, they sinned against their marriage. Now, commentaries will tell you that this was the custom of the land at that time. Even in some cultures today, what they did was perfectly legal, but not everything that is legal is good. 1 Corinthians 10:23 says, all things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. All things are lawful, but not all things edify. Just because something is legal, just because it's culturally accepted, does not mean that it is good for you. Cigarettes are legal. Cigarettes are culturally accepted. Are they good for you? No. It says right on the package that it will kill you. We should worry about our actions and our choices meeting the approval of God rather than the approval of society, rather than our decisions being made on whether something is legal or not. And before we move on, I want to look at Genesis 16:3 one more time. After Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar the Egyptian, her maid, and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. 10 years have passed since the last chapter. They are still waiting for the promise to come true, and I can understand their frustration. There are so many times in life that God's timing made absolutely no sense to me whatsoever until after that thing came to pass. In hindsight, we can always look back and say, oh, that's why God had me wait. I can see it now. When you're in the future, you understand why. But if you want to put your faith on display, right here is how you do it, brothers and sisters. Faith may be shown by going out and doing brave things when you are led to. Faith may be displayed when you live for God in a society that will hate you for it. Faith can be displayed for standing up for what is right, even if it costs you popularity, employment, friends, or even if it causes you pain. But if you really want to prove that your faith is strong, be patient. Wait on God. Let God be God, and you just sit there and you trust in His faithfulness. That is a sign of strong faith. Waiting on God and trusting in patience. It sounds simple, but I think that might actually be the hardest test of faith that some people will ever endure. And it's a test that I have failed myself more times than I care to admit. Let us continue on into verses 4 through 6. He went in to Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. And Sarai said to Abram, may the wrong done me be upon you. I gave my maid into your arms, but when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abram said to Sarai, behold, your maid is in your power. Do to her what is good in your sight. So Sarai treated her harshly, and she fled from her presence. This chapter is the example chapter. This whole chapter is just a list of consequences for making one bad decision. But these 3 verses right here set the whole stage for it. First, you have Hagar. She was the Egyptian servant that they picked up during Abram's lapse of faith in Egypt when Sarai was carried away into a harem. Yes, that sin and that lack of faith still has consequences too. Sin is the gift that keeps on giving. So Hagar, who is likely in her 20s or so, has been a faithful servant to Sarai. Now think about her suffering in this ordeal. She agrees to help Sarai in this plan. Now remember, Hagar is a pagan. She's from Egypt. She is still used to the harems and all of this at this point. She likely is not the person of the highest moral standards. But the fact that she, in her 20s, is willing to engage in this act and endure the pain of childbirth, all of the pain, the stretch marks, and everything else, just to have a baby that's not going to be hers, that's going to belong to somebody else. You got to admit, Hagar was a dedicated servant. Add to that, she is about to be coupled with an 85-year-old man. What is in this for her? Well, she would have some sort of privilege, I'm certain, but how would she know that going through all of this gross act is even going to be fruitful, if you know what I mean? Abram is pretty old, and he is childless. Who's to say that this plan is going to work and that Hagar would conceive? But even as good as her pagan intentions may have been, and her respect that she had for Sarai, here comes the consequences of sin knocking at their door. Verse 4 says, "And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight." Now, all of a sudden, Hagar starts feeling superior to Sarai because she conceived when Sarai was unable to. Not only that, she was now married to and sharing a child with Sarai's husband Abraham, who is perhaps the richest man in the land. So greed and pride began overtaking Hagar, who is really just a pawn in this whole story. We move on to verse 5. Sarai shifts the blame to her husband for following her idea. It says, "And Sarai said to Abram, 'May the wrong done upon me be on you.'" And then she says something that I'm sure she regretted one day. "May the Lord judge between you and me. Be careful what you wish for." Even though this was Sarai's mess that she had made, and now she is blaming her husband instead of taking responsibility for her own ideas, Abram isn't blameless in this either. He could have prevented this whole mess by not doing this thing that she suggested, and the same could have been said for Adam. Also, Abram had another opportunity to step up and to assert the authority that God gave him as head over the family, but Abram simply caved in to his wife's whims again. Maybe he was still in the doghouse for denying her in Egypt, so she would be safe. In verse 6, I picture Abram just kind of cowering in the corner. Maybe he's got fingernail scratch marks across his face or something, and he's whimpering, "Behold, your maid's in your power. Do to her what's good in your sight." In other words, this is your mess, dear. You deal with it. And so she did. She began to severely mistreat Hagar, who was willing to let her body be used and damaged to help them with her plans. Verse 6 says it was so bad that Hagar fled. How bad must the behavior have been for a woman that is pregnant with no father to help with the child to flee in the desert, not knowing where she is going to stay and where her next meal was going to be? How bad must that treatment have been? So this trusted maid has fled. Their marriage has been destroyed. Abram now has a son that's been driven away from them, and still no baby. Do you see how not waiting on God's timing is never a good decision? And the story just gets better. Let's go on into verses 7 through 9. "Now the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, 'Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from, and where are you going?' And she said, 'I am fleeing from the presence of my mistress Sarai.' Then the angel of the Lord said to her, 'Return to your mistress and submit yourself to her authority.'" Looking at verse 7, while she may not have known where she was going, it certainly looks like Hagar might have been headed home. Shur was between the south part of Canaan and Egypt, about where Hebron is. So even if she was headed back to Egypt, what's going to happen to her there? She was given as a gift by Pharaoh, and now she heads back home, having fled Abram's family. That's not going to be good. Not only did she defect, but she was also with child and alone. I really don't see where she had much of a promising future in Egypt either. This is an indicator of exactly how harshly Sarai must have treated her. It was bad enough that she would prefer the punishment of returning to Egypt or even dying out in the desert alone with nothing to eat. The fact that she stayed by this spring in verse 7 hints that she knew there may not be another source of water for a very long time. So here in verse 7, something amazing happens. It says, "The angel of the Lord appeared to her." This is obviously not an ordinary angel because the promise that he makes in verse 10 in a few minutes. No angel has the authority or the power to make promises and statements such as we're about to see. You know, like many other commentators, I also believe that this was a Christophany, a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus. So many times we forget that Jesus existed long before his incarnation. He was there even at creation. Jesus didn't begin in Bethlehem. He always was. Also, this phrase, the angel of the Lord, never appears again after the incarnation of Christ. It's always before Bethlehem. And here we find our Lord in the middle of a desert talking to a pagan single mom who has been rejected and has been despised. One can't help but think of when Jesus did the same thing with the woman at the well. I think this also was a divine appointment. She may have thought that she needed to stay at this spring in order to survive, but she was destined to encounter the Lord that day. We will see later in the text, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves here, that Hagar understood perfectly who this physically present person was, that it was God himself in human flesh. In verse 8, the Lord says, "Hagar, Sarai's maid, where have you come from and where are you going?" First of all, notice that he knows her. He knows everything about her. God also knows you. Out of the billions that have ever walked on this planet, he even knows you and every single detail. That tells me that he loves you. You don't put that much work into knowing something about someone if you're indifferent about them or if you don't care about them. The so-called gods of Canaan and those that Hagar knew in Egypt, if they could ever be real, they wouldn't know her in the same way that the Lord just acknowledged her, nor would they even care. But God does. He asked her where she came from and where she's going. Now we know God is omniscient. He already knows the answers to those questions. Just like when he asked Adam, "Where are you?" It was meant to cause them to have a moment of introspection, to make them stop and think. And Hagar sat there and she started to think, where have I come from? Where am I going? From one bad place to nowhere, from bad to worse. In verse 9, she was given some difficult orders. Return to your mistress and submit yourself to her authority. She might have been mistreated, but in all honesty, her smug attitude and her resenting Sarai only escalated the situation. There is really no innocent party here. Everybody is a victim and everybody is an offender in one way, shape, or form. Also notice that he didn't promise to change the situation if she went back. The promise would be the same. Sometimes the consequences of sin will remain in our lives as a reminder and a deterrent to stop sinning, to stop further sin. She is told to return and submit. The Lord never said that what Sarai done was okay. It never said that what Abram allowed was justified, but Hagar was to return and do her part in the role that she was called to live in. Common sense tells us that if we are obedient to God's command and his calling in our lives, there will be a blessing over our lives. No matter how hard things are, no matter how tough it is to hang on sometimes God will make things right, either in this life or in eternity, or both. I mean, you can bank on God doing what is right. Sometimes we may never know the reason why we endured suffering, why we went through mistreatment from others. Job never knew until he went home to be with the Lord. And sometimes God might just make it plain to you, as Hagar is about to be blessed with her own personal promise of the Lord. Let's check this out in verses 10 through 12. Moreover, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they too will be too many to count. The angel of the Lord said to her further, Behold, you are with child, and you will bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him, and he will live to the east of all his brothers. This baby that Hagar is carrying will be the father of many nations, also like Israel would be. And we know that they still exist today, and they're in very great numbers. Add to that, she's already carrying the answer to her promise. Unlike Abram and Sarai, Hagar is already conceived. And she is still young enough that she may get to see many generations come forth from him, unlike Sarai, who is old. Verse 11 also has a unique thing about it. It says, You will bear a son, you shall call his name Ishmael. This is the first time that a baby is given the name by the Lord before it is born. No ultrasound is going to be needed. He's going to be a boy, and here is what he will be named. In the Bible, the only times you find the Lord announcing the name of a baby before its birth is when God has a plan for that person. Now, we know that God has a plan for everyone. No person is a mistake, but I'm talking about something major that will occur because of this person's birth and their life. Think of the births of Isaac, Solomon, Josiah, John the Baptist, and Jesus. All of them were named before their birth. But even those whose names were given by their parents instead of the Lord, they still have a purpose. They're still part of God's plan. Jeremiah 1:5 says, Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I consecrated you. I have appointed you a prophet to the nations. But being this child's mother, Hagar's life is not going to be easy, and his own life will not be easy. In verse 12, Hagar was told that her little bundle of joy is going to be quite a handful, or as this verse says, a wild donkey of a man. A wild donkey is a figure of independence, fierce aggression, and self-will, or in plain English, a stubborn, defiant little monster. It wasn't intended to be an insult, for just the way the nations coming from him are going to be wild and free roaming, and yes, sometimes lawless. Ishmael is going to love his freedom, and he's going to live a nomadic life. Verse 12 also mentions the constant state of conflict that Ishmael and his descendants would live in. It says his hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. So he's not going to be the most popular person out at the table on Thanksgiving, to say the least. But there is one more part that we need to address before moving on. At the end of verse 12, it says, He will live to the east of all his brothers. Brothers is the word that I want to focus on. Not so much on the location where he lives, but the fact that he will be brothers. Ishmael's parents were Abram and Hagar. Isaac's parents are going to be Abram and Sarai. They had the same father, Abraham. They are brothers. Yet to this very day, there is a constant strife between the Arab nation and Israel, the children of Ishmael and the children of Isaac, even though they share common roots in Abraham. They are brothers. And when they're not busy fighting Israel, they're going to stay occupied fighting each other and everybody else. Just like the description given by the Lord while the first one, Ishmael, was still in the womb. It's kind of like the Lord can accurately predict the future, isn't it? Let's go on into verses 13 through 16. Then she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her. You are a God who sees. For she said, have I even remained alive here after seeing him? Therefore the well was called Beer Lahai Roi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. All we have on the person of Hagar is what is contained in the pages of Scripture. I'm sure that many people have formed different images of her in her mind. I got to admit that name is something different. I'd kind of pictured her as a homely person, to put it nicely, simply due to the name. The only Hagars that I grew up reading about were the singers Sammy Hagar or the bearded Viking in the comic strip Hagar the Horrible. So I pictured her as a red-headed bearded woman with a horned helmet that can't drive 55. No matter how she looked, we see here that she has a strong understanding of God, at least after this encounter. Maybe she was a proselyte. Maybe she converted to the faith in the one true God after dwelling in the tents of Abram's family and seeing God move through Abram. It's possible that she had heard many teachings while living with that family, but here her understanding of God is phenomenal. In verse 13, she says, you are a God who sees. One of the many names of God is El Roi, the God who sees me. But the most amazing part is the other part of verse 13. Have I even remained alive here after seeing him? Even before God had declared it later in Exodus 33, she knew that nobody could see God and live. Moses was only allowed to see his trail as he went by, the back of his glory, lest he die. Adam and Enoch may have walked with God, but that was his presence. God spoke to Abraham and Noah, but we aren't told that he appeared in a physical form to Noah. We aren't told of a physical appearance until right here, to this broken and dejected woman who is left to die alone. But yet she was undoubtedly left in awe and fear, just like Isaiah was when he saw the throne of God, just like Daniel and John when they saw Christ before them in his glory. I too would ask myself, how am I still alive? She was stunned. In verse 14, it says, therefore the well was called Beer Lahai Roi, because she was too stunned to speak and just uttered a bunch of unpronounceable words. No, I'm just kidding. Here, the well is called the well of the living God who sees. That's the English part of it. This would serve as a reminder and as a testimony of this event. When travelers would come through and ask, how did this place get its name? The story would be told again of how God met Hagar there in her time of need. In the final two verses, the birth of Ishmael comes to pass, and we see that Abram give the name Ishmael to his son with Hagar. So obviously she had spoken with Abram about her encounter at the well. Ishmael was actually Abram's firstborn son, which normally would mean that he receives the most significant blessing. But in this case, as the son of a moral compromise and as a product of weak faith, so he's going to take a second seat to Isaac, the son of promise. But the consequences of the sin of Abram and Sarai don't end there, and neither does their internal family conflict. That family conflict is going to rear its ugly head many times again in future chapters, as we will soon see. It has endured for many generations, and it's still alive today in the modern world.